The movement to the table has been submitted in writing. Are we voting on it? Okay. The clerk will call the roll on the motion to table. The clerk.
Mr. McCall. Aye. Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Higgins. Aye. Mr. Higgins votes aye. Mr. Guest. Aye. Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Aye. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Jimenez.
Aye.
Mr. Jimenez votes aye. Mr. Pfluger.
Aye.
Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Mr. Garbarino. Mr. Garbarino votes aye. Ms. Green.
Aye.
Ms. Green votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez.
Aye.
Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Lalota.
Aye.
Mr. Lalota votes aye. Mr. Ezell. Aye. Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. D'Esposito. Yes. Mr. D'Esposito votes aye. Ms. Lee. Aye. Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Luttrell. Aye. Mr. Luttrell votes aye. Mr. Strong. Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Burkeen. Aye. Mr. Burkeen votes aye. Mr. Crane. Mr. Crane votes aye. Ranking Member Thompson.
Nay.
Ranking Member Thompson votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee.
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Payne. No. Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Correa. No. Mr. Correa votes no. Mr. Carter. No. Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. Tanadar.
No.
Mr. Tanadar votes no. Mr. Magaziner.
No.
Mr. Magaziner votes no. Mr. Ivy.
No.
Mr. Ivy votes no. Mr. Goldman.
Nay.
Mr. Goldman votes no. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia votes no. Mrs. Ramirez. Mrs. Ramirez votes no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no.
How's the chair recorded?
The chair is not recorded.
Chair votes aye.
Chairman Green votes aye.
Clerk will tally the report, the tally.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 18 ayes and 14 noes.
The tabling motion stands, and the motion is moved to the table. Without objection, the clerk will report the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to HRes 863 offered by Mr. Green of Tennessee.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. I now recognize myself to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute. This amendment is in the nature of a substitute, expands on the underlying resolution by including 2 articles of impeachment. Article 1 relates to Secretary Mayorkas' willful and systemic refusal to comply with the law, and Article 2 relates to his breach of public trust. The amendment in the nature of a substitute also includes updated figures regarding illegal border crossings and other statistics. With that, I yield. Is there any further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, may I be recognized?
Yes, you may. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay. We're here based on 2 completely fabricated, unsupported, and never used before articles of impeachment. This is completely debasing and demeaning the impeachment clause of the United States Constitution, and it is a gross, gross injustice to the credibility of this institution. In your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, you quoted James Madison as saying that the impeachment clause is designed to remove bad men in office. But notably, the impeachment clause is not designed to remove bad policy from the office. And the definition of bad men, as Professor Pearlstein said, is an individual who abuses his power for personal gain. It has there's never been an impeachment in the history of the United States where someone has been impeached for something other than the abuse of power for purposes outside of his official duties. That is for elections, and that is for legislation. This, on the other hand, is an impeachment process that you are moving forward because you claim that Secretary Mayorkas, who's obviously working under the direction of President Biden, is failing to secure the border. The irony of the fact that Secretary Mayorkas has spent the last 2 months plus with a bipartisan group of senators negotiating legislation that would address the problems at the border should not be lost on anyone. You are sitting here right now trying to impeach a Secretary of Homeland Security for neglecting his duties literally while he is trying to perform his duties and negotiate legislation. Now, the real reason we are here, as we all know, is because Donald Trump wants to run on immigration as his number one issue in the November 2024 election. And you don't have to take my word for it, because he said it himself. And last week, numerous Republicans echoed his call. Why would we actually solve the problems at the border when it is such a good political message to use for the election? And Leader McConnell even reiterated in a closed-door meeting of the Republican members of the Senate that we're in a quandary, he said, because our candidate wants to run on immigration, and we don't want to get in the way of our candidate. Now, I know this weekend I saw Chairman McCall on TV and others, and you're changing your tune now because you said the quiet part out loud that this is all about politics, and so now it's, oh no, the president can do it without legislation. Never mind that you've been calling for H.R. 2 this entire Congress. No, now it's he can do it himself. Well, he's tried to do it himself. He's tried. He's passed numerous policies that would have streamlined the asylum process through ports of entry where migrants are vetted, that would have presumptively made ineligible anyone trying to cross the border in between ports of entry, and would have done a number of different things to address the problems. Republicans went to court to sue him, to stop him from implementing the policies to address the border. So your own party is sabotaging and undermining this administration's efforts to address the border while you are trying to impeach him by saying that they're not addressing the border. The hypocrisy is the least of it. Your attack on the rule of law and our democracy is the worst of it. And you better be careful about the bed that you make. I yield back.
The gentleman yields, and I appreciate the gentleman keeping his remarks within the 5 minutes because the day is going to be long. We're not going to do the typical over 5 minutes if you're continuing a thought. So keep your comments to 5 minutes, please. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to specifically talk about the Supreme Court's ruling, the United States versus Texas. President Biden's appointed Solicitor General, Elizabeth Prelogar, made a stunning claim asserting that no state, individual, or business has standing to challenge an administration's decision to, as a blanket matter, not enforce any particular law. When pressed by Justice Brett Kavanaugh if states and individuals were precluded from challenging this lack of enforcement, the president's own Solicitor General responded, "That is correct, but the framers intended political checks in the circumstances. Congress has tools at its disposal." Justice Kavanaugh responded, "I think your position is instead of judicial review, Congress has to resort to impeachment or dramatic steps in the face of such defiance of the laws passed by Congress." Prelogar's rejoinder was that in the face of dramatic abdication of statutory responsibility, by the executive branch, such steps would be warranted. In other words, if the Biden administration's own legal position, it is the Biden administration's own legal position before the Supreme Court that impeachment is proper remedy for dramatic abdication of statutory responsibility. Meaning, if a secretary is not adhering to the laws passed by Congress, the only recourse, because the states now don't have standing, is for the Congress to impeach. That is the rulings of the Supreme Court and the argument brought forward by President Biden's own Solicitor General.
Will the gentleman yield on that point?
I'll finish and then you can be recognized, Mr. Ivey. I think it's pretty clear that in that Supreme Court ruling, the state wasn't given standing. Now, the Supreme Court did not rule on whether or not the gentleman, the secretary, was adhering to the laws or not. But the discussion was about what do you do when they're not? And the conclusion of the court in the majority opinion was, both by Alito and Kavanaugh, impeachment and actions of the Congress are the only place for recourse of a situation like that. That's why we're where we are today. We have a secretary who has, the law is very clear, shall detain. It doesn't say create policies to allow for people to immediately be released in the country. It says shall detain. And that was not done. In fact, systems were created to do just the opposite of that. That is a violation of the Immigration and Nationality Act. It's actually willful and systemic. And when courts ruled you can't do that, he just repackaged it and continued to do just that. And the Supreme Court agrees that the only recourse is for Congress to take action when a secretary, and I will use the Solicitor General's own words, dramatic abdication of statutory responsibility. I yield. I yield my 5 minutes, and whoever else wants to be recognized.
Recognition.
Mr. Ivey, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With respect to the comments you just made, I refer the chairman and the committee to the actual opinion that was written by Justice Kavanaugh, which is the one that has the force of law, not necessarily the discussion with the Solicitor General Proligar. But on this particular point, the allegation that's being made in the articles of impeachment is that there's a willful defiance of enforcing the law. Justice Kavanaugh, with respect to that point, wrote this: as the district court found, the executive branch does not possess the resources necessary to arrest or remove all of the non-citizens covered by these two statutes. That reality is not an anomaly. It is a constant. For the last 27 years since those statutes were enacted in their current form, all 5 presidential administrations have determined that resource constraints necessitated prioritization in making immigration arrests. In other words, what he's saying, and this is in the context of the court's reference to cases like Waite, and those are prosecutorial discretion cases. For decades, the Supreme Court has deferred to the executive branch the right to make decisions about what to enforce, what not to enforce, and how to enforce it. And that's exactly what he's saying here. And it's especially powerful here because this deals with enforcement of the immigration laws, which is given special deference to the executive branch. So the language you just read and the article, the first section of the impeachment, are totally negated, not only by this language, but by the long history of the Supreme Court deferring to the executive branch and deciding what to enforce and how to enforce it. And that's exactly what we've got here. I think the argument that Secretary Mayorkas has not enforced these laws, he might not have liked the way he's done it, but I think it's clear in the letter he sent to the committee. And by the way, I thought it was totally appropriate for him to send the letter after the articles of impeachment had been released, since his comments should be related to the articles. But anyway, since May 12, 2023, DHS has removed or returned more than 500,000 individuals. Daily removals and returns are nearly double what they were compared to the pre-pandemic average of 2014 to 2019. I refer to page 2 of his letter, which is dated January 30, 2024. You all can read it and get the rest. But the point is this: the language that you're talking about, as the professor testified, is a total failure to do the job. And the points that she pointed, the issues that she pointed to were things like addiction or, physical inability to perform. We don't have that here. And the language that's in the letter that he sent and the data that's backed up by it show that he's actually been working on the job and doing the work, as done the recognition by the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, who've called him to the Hill to negotiate as they're negotiating a bipartisan solution to the problem. Unfortunately, we haven't done that, but they recognize that he's doing the job. And then the last point I want to make, your reference to...
Gentleman, yield for a question.
I can't because I'm running out of time. The last point I want to raise, though, is that your reference to impeachment being the only tool available, this is page 14 of the opinion. This is still Justice Kavanaugh. For example, this is where he's talking about options since there's no standing. What can Congress do instead? For example, Congress possesses an array of tools to analyze and influence those policies: oversight, appropriations, the legislative process, and Senate confirmation, and through elections. He does not mention impeachment. In fact, I'm not sure I saw impeachment mentioned anywhere in the opinion that he wrote. And by the way, there's a concurrence from Justice Gorsuch. All 3 of the Trump nominees to the Supreme Court agreed with this language. None of them supported the position that you just outlined. And it was an 8-1 decision. The articles of impeachment rely on Justice Alito's language. He's the sole dissenter in this case. So just based on the constitutional law as explained by the Supreme Court in the case that you cited in the article cite, it comes out exactly the opposite and undermines the claims that somebody could be impeached in the executive branch for following executive authority that the Supreme Court recognizes as theirs, especially in immigration cases, and that's been true for decade after decade. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Green for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congress has the responsibility to hold the executive branch accountable when they fail to uphold their oath of office, abuse their authority, and/or are dishonest with the American people. This is essential in a constitutional republic built on and separation of powers. In its 2023 ruling in United States versus Texas, the Supreme Court left the House of Representatives with little choice but to pursue impeachment articles against Secretary Mayorkas. The 5-4 majority did not address the Secretary's policies and mandates on the merits, but simply ruled the states did not have the standing to challenge them. Instead, the justices wrote that Congress has political tools available to push back on these policies. The only one that makes sense in the current political environment is impeachment. Remember, Democrats have completely rejected H.R. 2, our strongest security bill for our border. Secretary Mayorkas' actions and decisions clearly meet the standard necessary for initiating impeachment proceedings. This historical evidence is overwhelming that the Founding Fathers intended impeachment to be used to deal with the commission of indictable crimes and the abuse of power, corruption, and injury to the nation caused by public officials, among others. At the Constitutional Convention, the framers purposely devised the impeachment power to include any offenses against the nation's security committed by high officials. Stephen Bradbury, former principal deputy and acting assistant attorney general for the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice, there is a settled understanding beyond dispute that impeachable offenses include both prosecutable crimes and all manner of gross misconduct in office that does serious harm to the U.S. political system or the U.S. constitutional order. The actions, policies, and statements of Secretary Mayorkas easily meet that standard, and the American people completely agree. especially the witnesses that we've had before this committee, these parents who have had children murdered by fentanyl, murdered by illegal aliens, such as MS-13 crime gang members, and so much more. And I would tell you right now, the family of my two constituents that were killed in a horrific car accident by a 17-year-old cartel member smuggling illegal aliens into Texas would definitely agree with that. Secretary Mayorkas must be impeached for his failure to uphold his oath of office and for willfully breaking federal immigration laws. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes of comment on the amendment in the nature of the substitute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we should certainly, I think, be embarrassed to be here today. This is a complete sham impeachment. I also like to point out that the previous speaker on this committee has been spending a lot of her time actually fundraising off of this impeachment effort, and so the fact that she's posturing to taking it seriously, I think, is quite a joke as well. Now, in this Congress, which is the least productive that we've had, as we all know, since the 1930s, we've only passed 23 laws, and most of those, of course, have been generally terrible laws. But when the extreme majority cannot pass laws, they resort to political stunts and stunt impeachments, the one against the president and certainly the one here today. Now, we have heard over and over from constitutional scholars, including Republicans, that there's no basis for this impeachment. And I want to take a moment to correct the record on a couple things. I've heard my Republican colleagues claim that Trump secured the border and somehow President Biden opened it. Let's be clear and review the facts. The spike in migration started under Donald Trump. Border Patrol apprehensions actually tripled in the last 8 months of the Trump presidency, rising from more than 21,000 in May 2020 to over 71,000 that December as he was leaving office. So the migration spike started under Donald Trump, and we should make that very clear. Now, today, Secretary Mayorkas is also dealing with the fallout of historic crises happening across Latin America. Venezuela has completely collapsed and is in crisis. Ecuador is dealing with a historic gang crisis. Cuba and Haiti are also facing enormous challenges as well. The whole region is struggling to recover from extreme weather, droughts, and COVID-19. Meanwhile, our historic economic recovery in the U.S. has created a demand for workers. Now, all of this impacts the border. But we know that's not all. The majority blames Secretary Mayorkas for his policies for the surge of people coming here to seek asylum, but they won't accept any legislative proposals or funding to deal with the problem when the president and the secretary offer them. Speaker Johnson has told Fox News multiple occasions now that he's taking his orders from Trump on the border. And he just said recently, as of today, that he won't even take up the Senate deal. Donald Trump speaks about immigrants with the same rhetoric that Hitler did, claiming that immigrants like me and my family, and I quote, pollute the blood of this country. He wants chaos, and he's admitted he even would like to see a recession happening this year. But I want to remind the public and the majority that Donald Trump...
Will the gentleman yield?
I will not yield. I want to remind the public that Donald Trump and House Republicans also have their own ideas for the border. So let's review the majority's border ideas that they've actually presented. Here they are. Donald Trump actually has said that he wants to build alligator moats along the border. That's one of his incredible ideas. Another idea that Donald Trump has promoted is he actually wants to electrify the border fence and maybe even put some spikes on the border. That's another Donald Trump and MAGA majority border idea. Another idea, which I'm not sure how well it would go, is he wants to actually bomb northern Mexico with missiles. That's another Trump idea. And finally, I think one of the ones that I think is the most grotesque is suggestions that instead we should maybe just shoot migrants in the legs as they cross the border. So once again, the Donald Trump and MAGA plan is alligator moats, bombing northern Mexico, shooting migrants in the legs, and electrifying the fence and putting spikes on them. That is the Donald Trump border plan. And so, again, we are here today with these horrific ideas being presented constantly by the former president. This is all about trying to get Donald Trump reelected. Donald Trump himself is saying he wants no solutions this year out of the Congress, and Secretary Mayorkas and President Biden continue to offer solutions every day and are ready to actually talk about real immigration and border solutions in this country. And with that, I yield
Mr.
back.
Garcia, will you yield for a clarifying question?
Sure.
Can you clarify what you mean by the analogy that you just said that Donald Trump was Hitler?
Well, when you say that you want to pollute when immigrants are polluting this country, that to me and the blood of this country, that is absolutely reminiscent of things that Adolf Hitler said. And in fact, his imagery, the way he supports white nationalism, the way he supports white supremacy, and those kind of comments are completely offensive to immigrants and hopefully to all Americans in this country.
So just to be clear, you were drawing an analogy between Donald Trump saying he is like Hitler.
I'm drawing an analogy that the rhetoric that Donald Trump uses is very much the rhetoric and the type of